Well, good afternoon. My name is Andrew Blau, and it is my privilege to join you and to join you, Mariko, to host this capstone conversation anchored, as it says on the program, it's Imagining Bennington's Future. So it's anchored in that central notion of Bennington. Anchored there, but really given loft by the two words on either side that I have been hearing all day here at this inauguration, the words of imagination and the future. I have the privilege, when I'm not here, of working with leaders of organizations around the world who ask, how can we look out over the horizon? How can we see things before they're on our doorstep? How can we see what could shape our future and then act differently if we knew it? In my experience, one of the mistakes that people make when they look out into the future, when they try and imagine a future, is they either think too small. They think today is a really good indicator about tomorrow. Or they get trapped in denial, the kind of language you may have heard where you work or play, the language of, oh, that'll never happen. That's impossible. Or the language of paralysis. It's just too complicated. I don't know. I will say that's actually not what I've heard at Bennington. No one here seems trapped by a vision too small. No one here seems trapped by either denial or paralysis. In fact, I think today has been an incredibly rich conversation as I listen to the conversation from the opening notes of the processional to the speeches of welcome, to that fantastic poem that Michael Dumanis wrote. Could we have a round of applause for that poem? I love it. Your address, the speeches, the programs for the rest of the day. There are themes that take up your challenge, the challenge that says not just give voice, but roar. The themes that are roaring for me today already are about the inspiration of possibility and the trajectory of our biggest hopes. The importance of different ways of knowing, beyond what Mr. Gradgrind's basic facts, to the skills of what I think of as wayfinding, or the skills of sense-making. We have to navigate a world that seems increasingly uncertain and complex and ambiguous and is just getting more so. So ways of knowing in a world that challenges us like that, and a world that's also made by us, so we're responsible, heard that again and again, and a world that also makes us. I've heard people talk about ambition and imagination and hope and care, sort of wrapped up in this idea of stewardship, the power of exploration and discovery, collaboration, and its potential for new creation, and the potential for change. I was really struck this afternoon program how much of the program kept as a kind of a ground base the theme of transformation, but it didn't have just one register. It was transformation that could be desired, or transformation that became unintended, transformation that was uncontrolled, or change that could be shaped, either by high hopes or perhaps something less grand. Maybe I hear those things because that's what shapes my work, really looking at what's out in the world rather than what's under our control, and thinking about the world as it's changing. We're here to talk about imagining Bennington's future, and that's partly the future of higher education. But I want to go even bigger than that. I want to invite a conversation that's informed by these global trends about the way the world's population is changing, getting older in so many places and younger in just a few. The environment and the challenges and stresses that a changing environment is going to create, not just here, but again around the world. Changing technology, US trends around a changing economy and a changing workforce, growing inequality that seems inescapable for anyone who cares to look. And technology trends that are going to change education, how it's delivered, but also how we connect to it. How it's going to shape our expectations, the expectations of the people coming not just this year or next year, but 5 years or 10 years from now. So that's going to shape who comes to Bennington and why, and who will teach at Bennington and how. These, I think, as we imagine the best possible future, sit in the background. But with that, I want to turn to you and ask to get your thoughts about the future. And let's talk a little bit about what that might look like. I was struck in your opening remarks, in your inaugural speech, where you said education is about what kind of world we want to make. I get to travel around the world and talk to people around the world, and I know that in some ways it's getting smaller than ever, and it's also getting bigger. It's getting easier to read and understand, and yet harder to really see clearly and feel confident that we know what's going on. So here's the question. Let's talk about how education might need to change to meet a world that's both bigger and smaller, harder to read, or easier to read and harder to understand. What do you see happening?
Well, it's funny you put it that way, because I think actually, in a sense, education has to get both bigger and smaller.
Yeah.
And when I talked this morning about partnerships, to me, that's the getting bigger. It's not the only way to get bigger, but it's one of the ways to get bigger. Really thinking about not just what happens here, but all the ways in which what happens here is connected with what happens out there, and the ways in which what happens out there are connected to what happens here.
Yeah.
And we have the great good fortune of having that as part of our DNA, part of our history. But I think it's always the risk of a place like this, so to use Jonathan Letham's terms, kind of pocket utopia.
Yeah.
It's always, and it could be true, it is true of Bennington in a very particular way, but it could be true of many college campuses, I think, and not just college campuses, institutions of all kinds, that they become so much about being themselves that they forget that being yourself is a relational experience.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think Bennington really needs to continue to dig into that relational experience. We do it internally. We do it by the faculty we bring here and what we ask students to do, whether it's fieldwork term or the fact that faculty are practitioners out in the world with their, to take, let's say, the visual arts faculty, with their showing at the Walker and showing in New York and showing overseas, and that they are bringing all of those networks in while they're using the space and the environment here to create and push out. And so we ask everybody to do it as individuals here, and we always have. But I think we haven't done it yet enough as an institution. And I think that's actually true. I'm talking about Bennington, but I think that is largely true of a lot of institutions. When I was at Arizona State University, it was true that that institution, though public, though very big, was wonderful in many ways when the person I came with, Michael Crow, got there, but it was by no means as embedded in the community or as far-reaching and big thinking, but thinking in ways that are grounded in doable reality as it is today. And I think there are things that Bennington can learn from that, not that Bennington is going to become ASU, but I actually think there are things that all kinds of institutions, not just higher ed institutions, can learn from that, about how you balance the reaching out and the pulling in and the giving voice all together.
That actually touches on another theme I've been hearing, and I think is a great expression of it, and it's the theme of dialogue. A dialogue across time, dialogue between a place and its surroundings, a dialogue between the inside and the outside, really. And listen, I am not in education as you are, but even from the outside, it's hard to miss what an amazing transformation, to get back to that word, has happened at ASU. It really has transformed its relationship and is celebrated for that transformation. So it can be done. You know, the transformation of that relationship between a place and its community, and redefinition of the community. And yet, it's also the case that that dialogue will transform this place, and I think both in good ways and ways unintended. And it may change why people feel like they need to come to Bennington. I'm wondering, what's your thinking about why people will come here as compared to any place else, you know, as a place of dialogue, as a place that's changing its relationship to its world?
Well, I'll answer that, but I also want to pick up on something that you said a little bit earlier. In terms of why people will come here, one of the things that was so exciting to me in coming to Bennington, and of course still is that other places I've worked, actually not just institutions of higher education, in order to get people to work together, whether we're talking about interdisciplinary work and sort of higher ed speak, or we're talking about government silos, or we're talking about, there is this sense that you actually have to get a big donor and build a new building.
Yeah.
To
Yep.
force the chemists and the sociologists or whoever, right, the painters and the physicists or whoever it is to work together and to see one another. But one of the things about this place is that the pocketness of the utopia, it really means that there is a human scale element that I think can get lost in the sense that everything has to be bigger in order to meet the world, to your earlier point, right? That bigger is not necessarily what we need in every case.
Right.
And I really do believe in the institutional diversity aspect of what I talked about this morning, because bigger is good for some things and smaller is good for other things. And one of the things that is so animating about being at Bennington, in whatever, whether you're staff or faculty or students, is what in other places might be called interdisciplinary education, but here it's just what we do. And so the fact that that is so embedded in the culture, and one of the things that I have certainly seen as I've studied institutions, both very close up and from a little bit further away, is that they are so hard to change. Culture is so deep and so persistent, right? And you would think you could change out the management, you could change out the middle management, you could change... you could change out almost all the people, and yet still the culture is really persistent. And I think that is in our favor at Bennington. And I meant what I said, and I feel like this is really the way that we've been educating students and encouraging community and creation for over 80 years. It's not that its moment wasn't then, its moment was then, but its moment has come in a very different way now because we have that interwovenness in our experience in the institutional DNA.
Yeah.
And I want to do everything to help it to grow and thrive, but I couldn't kill it if I tried. You know? So I think there is this kind of, it's almost like it vibrates in that way. And when I think about who should come, to get to your question, when I think about who will be drawn here and who should come here, to me, it's the problem solvers, right? It's the people who really want to roll up their sleeves. And the problem, the scale of the problem when you start can be big or it can be small. Small problems are not easy to fix, right? So just because the scale is small doesn't mean that it isn't worth addressing. And sometimes the smallest, what seems like the smallest problem is actually a tiny little window, like those little Easter eggs. Do you ever have those when you were a kid, where you look in the little window and there's a whole world in there? Sometimes it's this tiny window into the big, big world.
Yeah. Well, now I want to go back to something you said, because I think your answer was so much more interesting than my question.
This is why I invited him.
So it reminded me a little bit of Jonathan Letham's challenge about sustainability, right? And sustainability, he challenged you and this community to think about sustainability not in the sustainability of a machine, but in the sustainability of an artwork, right? With very different kind of sustainability. Your answer, however, speaks to another kind of sustainability, and that is the way in which what can be sustained is not always what we intended to be sustained, right? In my field, in working with strategy, one of the not quite even a secret, it's well known that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture is enduring in a way that strategy often isn't. And strategy to change a place, even with the best hopes in mind, can run up against the challenge of culture. This is a place that has these high hopes and aspirations around change. Sometimes what's most sustainable, though, is the past. What are the new possibilities that you're excited about to bring the change that sustains us without losing track of what has made this place so great?
Well, I don't want to overstep my, is Carrie Woods here? No, because I don't want to overstep my ecosystem metaphor or get in trouble. But to me, sustainability here, well, Dan, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Sustainability here and out in the world too, and in all the ways that we talk about it, I think sometimes it gets conflated with conservation. And there's a role for conservation too, to be sure. But sustainability is really about new growth. Right? You want to keep the old growth, but you want to generate the new growth. And that balance, that tension, I talk about, I feel like I shouldn't name it in this context, but so I went to Yale as an undergraduate, I had a great time, it's a wonderful place. But one of the things that I noticed on my student tour, so I was in Branford College, which is, its claim to fame is that it's the oldest and most beautiful. So the fact that because it's the oldest, that's supposed to be something. But also the architecture was actually, the buildings were created to look old, right? To look like Oxford and Cambridge. When they finished them, they decided they didn't look old enough, right? They didn't have the gravitas. They didn't look old enough, so they poured acid on them to make them look older, right? So it's like conservation of something that didn't exist in the first place. But it is a kind of a desire to preserve an idea in order to give weight to what comes next.
Yep.
And I think there is something to that, but one of the things that I feel very fortunate about in Bennington is that so much of what we're about is that new growth.
Yeah.
And when I talked about that creative restlessness this morning, it's the human condition. And the human condition is kind of in that tension point between that creative restlessness and that drive for discovery that we heard about from Lori Leshin today, or that generative experience of making art and making work, and the wanting to be grounded in most people's cases. Maybe Lori is thinking about, what was it, 37 billion years? Or 13 million years, but for most of us, we're thinking about being grounded in the human experience.
Right.
Right? We're being grounded in the past. And it is true that what has happened in a place, a physical place, and a conceptual or spiritual, if I could use that word, place, a cultural place, is important, because every entity, every element, every person, every dog who comes through a place actually is part of making that fabric. Yeah. And so sometimes it might be one very small stitch. Yeah. Sometimes it's a really big one. But the experience that we have today is driven by what came before. But the thing about, I think, a really productive life, in a sense, and also about this place, is that it's about that tension.
Yeah. No,
what was your question?
I think that tension, there's a couple tensions you've been talking about. One is the tension between dreaming about the past versus dreaming about the future, nostalgia versus hope or aspiration. And every place has got it. I mean, we stand in a tradition, even when we wish we didn't. We still, we're informed by that. We can't help ourselves. And some of those are traditions of what it means to go to college, why, what we expect to get from it, and how it informs, why Bennington comes up on someone's radar screen and says, when you said someone who needs Bennington, that's also part of a, standing in a tradition. And yet we're doing it, we're having that conversation in a world that, again, beyond our ability to control, is going to change. Let's get concrete for a moment, or a little more concrete. Look out 5 years, 10 years from now. So the kids, my oldest son is 12. So in, I guess, 8 years or so, he's going to be thinking about college. What are 12-year-olds, much less 8-year-olds, what are students and their families going to ask of a great college like Bennington 2020, 2025?
So I think, particularly in the U.S., right? So if we took a global view, we would have actually quite different set of answers, I think, to that question.
We should come back to that, yeah.
Okay. But let's take the U.S. for the moment. And I think ideally what we will see is different families asking different questions, right? Obviously that happens now to some degree. But I really do think that we run the risk, in a funny way, it's to your original point about being bigger and smaller. So we're having this public conversation about higher education that really is kind of squooshing down and flattening out the idea of what you get out of college. And there is a very vocal defense of the liberal arts, defense of this thing, defense of that thing, and that's all fine. Yeah. And it has its place. But to me, what we should be thinking about and talking about is much closer to the question that you pose, or it's really the obverse of the question that you pose, which is, what should we be wanting to provide
Right.
as an environment, as a culture, as a place,
Mm-hmm.
5 years from now, 10 years from now?
Mm-hmm.
And that requires institutions to think about the future,
Mm-hmm.
institutions of higher ed, in ways that they traditionally haven't as institutions, right? So there are plenty of people in institutions of higher ed who think about the future. It's their job to think about the future, or
Right.
it's their job to think about the past, but they are connecting it. They're living in that tension, right? Because humans do. But institutions often don't.
Right.
Institutions are often much more about the past than they are about the future, right? And so figuring out as institutions of higher education how we can be about the future
Yes.
instead of being about the past, or in addition to, I guess I would say, learning from the past instead of being about the past.
Very important distinction, isn't it? Yep.
So how do we learn from the past,
Yep.
and how do we be about the future?
And how not to get trapped. And here's another trap. A friend of mine in New York, a guy called Clay Shirky, mostly thinks about technology, but he had this very interesting observation about institutions. And he observed that so many institutions become actually dedicated to the problem they were created to solve.
Yep.
Right? So they become dedicated to the problem they were created to solve, which means they can't let it go.
Yep.
Even as the world changes and the problem changes, the thing that's actually holding on to the problem is that institution. And it's-
Dan, can we call that institutional path dependence? I don't know where
And so the way in which you ask a really deep question, how will institutions not be trapped by the problem they were created to solve, whether it was in 1930 or 1830 or 1630? We do know that institutions can change, and they're changed actually by the people in them, and they also have this durability, this thing that continues. I think that partly they're both grounded and change around this idea that you're also touching on about what it means to be educated. Because I think, we can look back and see what education meant for, people of a certain class in 1830 or 1730, and it's going to be very different in 2030 for sure. And part of it's going to be focused on the thing I said I want to come back to, which is all those people around the world. Let's talk about that. Let's go there. Let's go to the, Bennington as a place, not just in America, but in the world. How's the world going to change Bennington? Who's going to come? What will they ask of you?
I mean, at the very sort of baseline operational level, it's going to be ever more international students and international faculty.
We've seen that already?
We're seeing that already, and that's the trend.
Yep.
It's the trend for higher education in general. It's the trend for Bennington, too, and I think it's a good one. Because I think on a certain level, we're actually not doing the service that we need to do. We're not doing right by our students if we are not becoming our American students, if we're not becoming more international. Not to mention the fact that if we believe in what we do, we actually should want many more people from around the world to have this kind of experience.
Right, right.
And so at the kind of tactical level, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
that's absolutely where I think we need to head, but I don't think that's the only, from a tactics point of view, I don't think that's the only way to do it. The other ways to do it are back to the kind of network idea that we were talking about in the beginning, is bringing people in multiple ways.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to have people physically here to talk to look in the eye,
Yeah.
to hug at the end, but there are lots of other ways to bring in.
Yeah.
And obviously technology enables that, but technology is not the end, right? Technology is the means.
I hope so.
And I think there are a number of ways we could think about that, and think about that at Bennington. So I mentioned David Ciccarelli, who created the Max programming language or helped develop it. He's an alum. And I think right now we're talking about technology in higher ed largely in terms of delivery.
Yeah. Right.
We're not yet really talking about it in terms of co-creation.
Right.
And that's where the fun is,
Yeah.
right? That's where the meat is. And that's where the Bennington experience is, whether it's co-creation between teacher and student, or it's among students, or it's alums out in the world. It is that moment when the two people, two ideas, or 17,000 ideas and two people, or 17 people and 3 ideas, come together and try to kind of make it make it fit,
Yeah.
and then figure it out and throw it all out and start all over again. And that is not yet where we are in terms of education. And so I think taking what people have thought of as being only for the big, MOOCs and blah, blah, blah,
Right.
and making it actually about for the intimate.
Yeah.
How do we do that? How do we think about that in ways that both amplify not just what we do here, but what's possible?
Yeah. Now that balance between scale and intimacy, what needs to be big, and what's best when it's small.
That's right. And it's not about how small you can make your phone and how close you can
No.
get to your
So
screen.
if I'm reading the signals right, I think I've got time for one more question for you. And we've talked about all kinds of other things, the college, the world, the students, the families. We haven't talked much about you. And being a leader now is also changing, right? I mean, what it means to lead in the 21st century is changing. So let me ask you maybe the Bennington version question of the, your leadership challenge. How are you going to make your plan, and what's your fieldwork going to be?
Well, so you have to do one every year, right? Fieldwork term. You don't have to do a plan every year. You do your fieldwork term every year. So this year, my fieldwork term was being out with some of you, out meeting alumni, out meeting former faculty, out meeting staff, people who, both obviously the people who work here, but also the people who have worked here and who have brought the work of here out into the world in various ways. And really talking and listening to all of them. And here, let's see, what did we decide? On the West Coast, I met like 750 alumni, and so that's a lot of, somebody figured out how many hands I shook or something really terrifying like that. But, the shaking hands is nice, but really it's about listening in that conversation and then bringing that back, because fieldwork term is not just about what you do when you're out there, it's about how you bring it back into the experience, both into your own experience, but also into the community experience. And so that was my fieldwork term this year. We don't make people decide this year what their fieldwork term next year is going to be.
All right.
but because it should come out of the experience, right? It's not about coming in and saying, well, you might have some idea what you want your 4 fieldwork terms to be, or more than 4, if you're me, maybe. But it's not just about it's not about knowing exactly what you want to do exactly when you want to do it. The whole experience, the educational experience at its best really here or anywhere else, is about that discovery, that trajectory of discovery. So that was my first fieldwork term. And in terms of my plan, so I think people caught a glimpse of what it might look like today.
I hope so.
Somebody asked me, how did I pick the people to do the various sessions this afternoon? And I picked the people I wanted to hear. Pick the people I wanted to talk to, and the things I wanted to learn about and experience, from the inflatable space to listening to Dan and Sven to whatever else, everything else. And so to me, it wasn't, I didn't actually pick people who I knew what they were going to say. I picked people I wanted to learn from. And so that's the first step to me in the plan. And then, we could sit here next year and I could tell you, and then I'll write my plan essay and all of that stuff. But to me, it's about that trajectory of discovery.
Yeah, and it's a plan to learn, and learning to plan, and so on and so forth. In closing, let me observe that from everything I've heard and everything I've seen and all the conversations I've either been part of or the conversations I've had the pleasure of listening to other people lead, the speakers, the students, the guests, the friends, the family, the people in this audience, in this community are a gift. And I think together, I'm convinced by my time here today that you're going to create some possibilities that go beyond even the best of what you already see now. So this community, you are the leader, and yet you are the leader in a community, and that community is a gift. But it's not yours. You're theirs. So I want to close by asking you to go together with this audience and with this community and make this place the resonator of the best possibilities you imagine, and go together and make the world a Bennington place. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.